Picture the weight of a single word, a term of address, or a carefully chosen verb, carrying the fate of thousands. In the halls of power today, a diplomatic communique is dissected for nuance, but over 3,000 years ago, the stakes were even higher. This was the world of the Hittite Empire, a Bronze Age superpower whose survival depended not just on the strength of its chariots, but on the cunning hidden within its diplomatic language. Every treaty, every letter exchanged with rivals like Egypt, was a masterpiece of coded communication, where Brotherhood could mask suspicion and a promise of peace might contain the blueprint for betrayal. We are about to journey inside the secret language of Hittite diplomacy, a labyrinth of empire and deception built entirely on words. The entire system rested on a foundation of clay. Imagine the royal archives of the capital city, Hattusa, not with paper files, but with thousands of meticulously inscribed tablets, each one a frozen moment of high-stakes statecraft. These were not simple records. They were the equivalent of classified intelligence briefings and binding international agreements, written in a script that itself was a code within a code. For the Hittites, language was the ultimate weapon, a tool so precise that it could hold a sprawling empire together without constant warfare. They understood a profound truth that echoes in our own time, that the most powerful conflicts are often won or lost not on the battlefield, but in the subtle spaces between words, in the meanings left unstated but perfectly understood. Their diplomats and scribes were the original spin doctors, the architects of reality through narrative. So why does the fate of a forgotten empire matter to us now? Because the very language of modern global politics, the terms like strategic partnership, non-aggression pact, and mutual assurance finds its roots in the diplomatic laboratories of the Hittites. The ways we navigate trust and suspicion between nations today are direct descendants of the codes they pioneered. This story is more than a history lesson. It is a key to understanding the hidden architecture of power that still operates all around us. As we decipher these ancient messages together, from the illusion of familial bonds to the terrifying curses sworn to the gods, you will start to hear the faint echo of Hittite scribes in today's headlines. This is a journey into the heart of how empires speak, and more importantly, how they lie, a tale of words that built a world and the betrayals that ultimately brought it down. To truly understand the secret language of Hittite diplomacy, we must first stand in the shadow of the empire itself. This was not a minor kingdom but a colossal force that dominated the landscape of the ancient Near East for nearly 500 years. Their heartland was the rugged, mountainous plateau of Anatolia, a land of harsh winters and strategic passes that provided a natural fortress. From this powerful base, the Hittites expanded their influence until their territory stretched from the shores of the Aegean Sea all the way to the mighty Euphrates River, placing them in direct contention with the other superpowers of the Bronze Age, Egypt to the south and Babylon to the southeast. This was a realm of immense scale and diversity, encompassing many different peoples, languages, and cultures, all bound under the authority of the Hittite king. The key to holding this vast domain together was not simply the sharpened blades of their army, feared for its advanced chariot corps, but something far more sophisticated, a genius for administration. The Hittites were master organizers. Their capital, Hattusa, was a marvel of urban planning and defense, nestled in the mountains north of modern-day Ankara. Visitors approaching the city would have been awestruck by its massive, sloping stone walls, its grand gateways guarded by colossal stone lions and sphinxes, and the towering temples that reached for the sky. But the true treasure of Hattusa, and indeed the entire empire, lay inside its administrative buildings, vast libraries and archives filled with thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. These were not just religious texts or epic poems, they were the legal and diplomatic bedrock of the state, the filing cabinets of an empire. This intricate bureaucracy allowed the Hittites to manage a complex system of control based on vassal treaties and strategic marriages. Instead of conquering and directly ruling every territory, they often preferred to install local rulers who swore binding oaths of loyalty to the Hittite king. These vassal kings were bound by meticulously detailed treaties that outlined their obligations, how many soldiers to provide in wartime, what annual tribute to send to Hattusa, and promises to extradite political fugitives. In return, the great king offered military protection and legitimacy. It was a system of calculated reciprocity, a web of obligations and loyalties that required constant maintenance. Add to this the practice of diplomatic marriages, where Hittite princesses were sent to marry foreign kings, weaving a network of familial ties that served as both alliance and surveillance. This entire structure, however, was incredibly fragile. A misunderstood promise, a vague clause in a treaty, or a perceived slight in a letter could unravel years of careful diplomacy and spark rebellion. The empire's sheer size and the diverse nature of its subjects meant that communication had to be flawless. The language used in these treaties and letters couldn't afford to be ambiguous. It had to be a precise instrument capable of conveying subtle shades of meaning, from firm command to gentle persuasion, from genuine alliance to veiled threat. The need to govern such a vast and varied collection of territories through paperwork and promises, rather than just military garrisons, is precisely what forced the Hittites to develop their diplomatic language into such a nuanced and at times secretive code. The empire's survival depended on the power of the word, making every scribe who mastered this language a guardian of the realm. But to truly access the thoughts of the Hittite kings, we first had to find their library. The story of that discovery begins not in the Bronze Age, but in the early 20th century, with a team of German archaeologists meticulously excavating the windswept ruins of Hattusa. What they unearthed was nothing short of staggering, a royal archive containing not dozens, not hundreds, but over 30,000 clay tablets. This was not a random collection of broken pottery. It was the intact central filing system of an empire, a treasure trove of state secrets preserved in fire. For the very conflagration that destroyed the city around 1200 BCE had baked the clay tablets, hardening them and ensuring their survival for over 3 millennia. These were not simple inventory lists of grain or livestock, though those existed too. These tablets held international treaties, confidential intelligence reports, diplomatic letters, legal codes, and detailed instructions to ambassadors. They were, in essence, the complete declassified records of Hittite foreign policy. The information was locked in the intricate script known as cuneiform, a writing system made by pressing a reed stylus into wet clay to create wedge-shaped impressions. But the linguistic picture was complex. The Hittites used their own language, an Indo-European tongue strangely preserved in the heart of the ancient Near East. But they also frequently used Akkadian, which was the diplomatic lingua franca of the era, much like English is in international business today. This meant a single archive could contain a letter from the Hittite king to the pharaoh of Egypt written in Akkadian, sitting right next to a secret internal memo between Hittite officials written in their native language. Deciphering this vast corpus was a monumental puzzle for scholars. They weren't just learning a dead language, they were piecing together the entire bureaucratic mindset and diplomatic conventions of a vanished civilization. They had to become experts in Hittite legal formulas, understand the proper way to address a vassal king versus an equal, and learn the subtle cues that separated a genuine offer of peace from a thinly veiled threat. There is a profound weight to these physical objects that goes beyond the words they bear. Imagine a Hittite scribe, a highly trained official, sitting down to record a treaty that would bind two nations. He would take a lump of wet clay, smooth it into a tablet, and then with immense concentration press his stylus to create each precise wedge. This was a slow, deliberate process. There was no delete key, no easy way to correct a major error. The very medium of clay demanded careful thought before any mark was made. This physical act of writing imbued each message with a sense of permanence and grave importance. A treaty wasn't just words, it was a tangible object, an artifact of the agreement that could be stored, transported, and presented. The size and shape of the tablet could even convey meaning. A large, beautifully inscribed tablet for a major treaty with Egypt, a smaller, more utilitarian one for a routine message to a provincial governor. Each one of these 30,000 tablets is a frozen moment in time, a direct line to the strategic thinking in the halls of power. When we read a letter from a Hittite king complaining about a delayed shipment of iron from a vassal state, we are hearing the authentic voice of imperial frustration. When we study the clauses of a treaty, we are looking over the shoulder of the negotiators as they hammer out the terms. The survival of this archive is nothing less than a miracle, offering us an unprecedented window into the day-to-day workings of ancient statecraft. It sets the stage for everything that follows, because it is from this clay foundation that we can finally begin to understand the specific, sophisticated linguistic tools the Hittites employed to build and maintain their empire. This is the raw data, the primary source material that allows us to crack their codes. Now, let's crack open that first and most fundamental diplomatic code, the language of brotherhood. In the high-stakes world of ancient diplomacy, perhaps no word was more powerful or more deceptive than the simple term, brother. When the Hittite great king sat down to compose a letter to his counterpart, the Pharaoh of Egypt, he did not address him as Your Majesty or exalted ruler. Instead, the letter would begin with the intimate greeting, "Say to my brother, the king." This was not a casual expression of friendship. It was a deliberate and calculated political tool, a carefully crafted fiction of parity between two colossal powers who are often fierce rivals. In a world defined by rigid hierarchy, calling another king brother was a revolutionary act. It created an artificial plane of equality, a shared space where negotiation could happen without either monarch feeling they were conceding superiority before the talks even began. This linguistic frame suggested a relationship built on mutual respect and shared interests, as if the two rulers were partners managing the affairs of the world, rather than competitors jockeying for dominance. It established a psychological foundation for compromise, making it possible for a pharaoh to make concessions to a brother that he would never consider making to a mere rival. But this illusion of brotherhood was just that, an illusion. True equality between these empires was exceptionally rare. The balance of power was constantly shifting. One year, the Hittites might be stronger after a military victory. The next, Egypt might gain the upper hand. The brotherly language cleverly papered over these underlying tensions and power imbalances. It provided a stable, consistent form of address that could endure through periods of both peace and cold hostility. We see this masterfully employed in the most famous example, the Treaty of Kadesh, concluded after a massive, indecisive battle between the Hittite king Hattusa III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. The text of the treaty is saturated with the language of brotherhood. They pledge to be brothers forever and promise that good peace and good brotherhood will exist between them. Yet, if you read the fine print, a different story emerges. The clauses, while mutually beneficial, often contain subtle advantages for the Hittites. For instance, the agreement for mutual military aid is carefully worded so that the Hittites are only obligated to assist Egypt if Egypt is attacked first, protecting them from being dragged into an Egyptian offensive war. The brotherly facade allowed both sides to claim victory. Ramuses could present the treaty as a pact between equals, saving face after failing to achieve a decisive win. Hattusa could secure a lasting peace that stabilized his Syrian frontiers. The Code of Brotherhood made this face-saving possible, preventing the humiliation that could have forced a resumption of hostilities. This use of familial terms was at its core a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation. By framing the relationship in the emotionally charged language of family, the Hittite scribes were tapping into a deep-seated human instinct for kinship and obligation. It is far harder to betray a brother than it is to betray a treaty partner. The term carried a weight of implied loyalty and shared destiny. It built a relational framework that made compromise and cooperation feel like natural, honorable actions between family members, rather than cold, calculated political concessions. This practice of coded kinship reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The Hittites were pioneers in using emotional language as a tool to achieve cold, rational political ends. They realized that binding an empire required more than laws and threats. It required the perception of relationship. This strategy of using warm, personal language to mask hard political realities is a thread we will see running through their diplomacy, and one that will take on a much darker and more sinister character when applied not to equals, but to subordinates, a transformation we will explore next. But the comforting fiction of brotherhood was only one side of the coin. For every promise of mutual respect offered to an equal, there existed a far sterner language designed to command obedience from those beneath the Hittite throne. This was the shadowy realm of oaths and curses, a code that transformed dry legal agreements into sacred covenants enforced by the terrifying power of the gods. When a vassal king placed his hand on the tablet to swear allegiance, he wasn't just agreeing to a political contract. He was entering into a supernatural bargain. The treaty itself would contain long, meticulously detailed sections listing the divine punishments that would befall him, his family, and his entire kingdom should he ever prove disloyal. These were not vague warnings. The language was brutally graphic, painting visceral pictures of suffering and ruin. A king might swear that if he broke his oath, the 1,000 gods of the Hittite pantheon would destroy his land, his male children, his female children, his descendants, his army, his horses, his chariots, and blot his name from the earth. The curse sought to erase not just the individual, but his entire legacy from history. This was far more than mere boilerplate legal text. It was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, carefully engineered to instill a deep and lasting fear. The curses were often shockingly specific to make the threat feel immediate and inescapable. They might describe a particular god striking the oath breaker with a loathsome disease, filling his body with pus, or ensuring that his crops would fail year after year until his people starved. Another common curse invoked military defeat, promising that the gods would put the bronze spear of the enemy in his heart or shatter his weapons on the battlefield. By naming these tangible disasters famine, plague, war, the Hittite scribes connected the abstract concept of betrayal to the most fundamental fears of any ancient ruler, the loss of health, power, and prosperity. The message was clear. Betraying the Hittite king was not just a political miscalculation. It was an act of impiety that would invite the active wrath of the entire divine world. This practice fundamentally changed the nature of the agreement. A treaty backed by divine curses was no longer a simple document of state. It became a sacred instrument, its authority derived from a higher power than any human king. This gave the Hittites a tremendous advantage. They could enforce their will from a distance without always needing to deploy their army. The threat of divine retribution acted as a powerful, self-executing deterrent. A vassal king contemplating rebellion had to perform a grim cost-benefit analysis, weighing the potential political gain against the near certainty of supernatural ruin. The language of the curses framed this calculation in stark theological terms. Loyalty meant the continued favor of the gods, manifested as good harvests and healthy heirs. Betrayal meant inviting cosmic punishment upon everyone he was sworn to protect. This system brilliantly leveraged the profound religiosity of the age, making faith itself a pillar of imperial control. The gods, in effect, became the Hittite Empire's most reliable and far-reaching enforcers, their imagined vigilance ensuring compliance across vast distances. This intimate fusion of spiritual belief and political power reveals a core truth about Hittite statecraft. Their authority was as much theological as it was territorial, a duality that would define their approach to governance in every aspect. Yet behind every carefully chosen term of brotherhood and every terrifying divine curse stood a figure whose skill made it all possible, the scribe. To think of these individuals as mere clerks copying dictation would be a profound mistake. They were the true cryptographers of the Hittite Empire, the highly educated architects of its diplomatic reality. Trained in extensive schools, these men mastered not only the complex cuneiform script, but also the art of language itself. Their expertise went far beyond grammar. It extended into the dangerous waters of politics, psychology, and nuance. A scribe's primary tool was ambiguity wielded with surgical precision. He had to possess the ability to draft a single message that could be read in two completely different ways, one that conveyed a firm warning to the recipient king, and another that provided plausible deniability, a softer interpretation that could be presented to that king's advisors or allies. This was the heart of their craft. Consider the immense pressure on a scribe tasked with composing a letter to a vassal king who was testing the limits of his loyalty. The scribe could not simply write, "Obey or we will invade." Such bluntness might force the vassal into a corner, making rebellion his only option for saving face. Instead, the scribe would employ a sophisticated vocabulary of euphemisms and implied meanings. A phrase like, "The great king has noted your recent actions with displeasure," was not a simple statement of emotion. In the coded language of the court, it was a grave warning, likely meaning military preparations were already underway. Similarly, "We remind you of the great favor shown to your father," was not a nostalgic reminiscence. It was a subtle threat, implying that past support could be withdrawn, leaving the vassal vulnerable to his enemies. The scribe's job was to find the exact phrase that would make the vassal's blood run cold without giving him a concrete, public insult to rally against. The coding extended to the very structure and physicality of the document itself. The positioning of clauses was critical. Placing a demand for increased tribute immediately after a reminder of military protection created a causal link justifying the demand. Strategic repetition of the vassal's title could either reinforce his subordinate status or, if used sparingly, offer a subtle compliment. Even the size and shape of the clay tablet sent a message. A large, elegantly inscribed tablet delivered by a high-ranking envoy signified the importance of the communication and respect for the recipient. A smaller, hastily written tablet delivered by a minor official could be a deliberate sign of disrespect, a way to put a rival in his place without a single confrontational word. The scribe controlled all these variables, understanding that diplomacy was a form of theater where every prop and every line held significance. these individuals were, in every sense, the ancient world's equivalent of modern-day lawyers, political strategists, and intelligence analysts rolled into one. They needed an intimate knowledge of the historical relationships between states, the family trees of rival dynasties, and the particular religious sensitivities of different cultures. A curse invoking a god that was not widely worshipped in the vassal's region would lack its intended psychological power. A reference to a past event that was misremembered or misrepresented would shatter the credibility of the entire message. Theirs was a profession built on a vast archive of institutional knowledge, requiring them to be walking encyclopedias of international affairs. To deconstruct a Hittite diplomatic text without understanding the scribe's role is to see only the surface of the words. The true meaning lies in the gaps, the emphases, and the silences they so expertly engineered. They were the guardians of the empire's secret language, and their meticulous work in the scriptorium was as vital to Hittite power as the chariots on the battlefield. While the language of brotherhood and divine curses set the emotional and spiritual boundaries of the Hittite Empire, the real engine of control was found in the dry, legalistic text of the Vassal Treaties. These documents were the operating manuals for the empire's vast network of subordinate states, and within their precise clauses, the Hittites perfected a third, more subtle code, the art of strategic ambiguity. On the surface, these treaties were models of exhaustive detail. They would meticulously list the number of soldiers a vassal king was required to contribute in wartime, the exact weight of the annual tribute in silver and gold, and even specific promises, such as extraditing political fugitives who fled across the border. This created an illusion of total clarity, a contract that left no room for misunderstanding. Yet, nestled among these explicit demands were deliberately planted landmines of vagueness. A clause specifying military support might conclude with the phrase, "and you shall provide such other aid as is customary." The word customary was the masterstroke. What was customary? Who defined it? The Hittite king, of course, and his definition could change depending on the strategic needs of the moment. This ambiguity was not an oversight by a careless scribe. It was a brilliantly designed feature of the imperial system. For the Hittite suzerain, this vagueness was a source of immense power and flexibility. In a sudden crisis, when the empire faced an unexpected invasion or internal rebellion, the great king could point to that vague clause and demand resources far beyond what the vassal had anticipated. It was a built-in emergency lever, allowing the central power to tap into the reserves of its entire network without having to renegotiate every single treaty. This prevented the bureaucratic paralysis that could doom an empire in a fast-moving conflict. From the perspective of the vassal king, however, this same ambiguity created a constant state of low-grade anxiety. He could never be entirely sure if he was fully meeting his obligations. This uncertainty was a powerful psychological tool. It kept the vassal in a perpetual state of anxious compliance, always looking to Hattusa for cues, always striving to please, because he never knew when a failure to interpret the customary aid correctly would be used as a pretext for punishment or outright annexation. This gray area became a testing ground for loyalty. A vassal's response to an ambiguous request revealed his true allegiance. A king who readily provided the extra, customary troops or tribute when asked was demonstrating his integration into the imperial system. Another who hesitated, questioned, or refused was immediately flagged as potentially disloyal. This allowed the Hittites to identify problems before they escalated into full-blown rebellions. The vague clause acted as a pressure valve and an early warning system simultaneously. It also provided a way to manage the egos of proud local rulers. Granting them a small sphere of autonomy in interpreting their duties allowed them to save face and maintain a sense of dignity in their own courts. They could tell their own advisors that they were negotiating the terms of their service, not just blindly obeying orders. This delicate dance of control and perceived autonomy was essential for governing a diverse collection of cultures and kingdoms without resorting to constant military intervention. The Hittites understood that a vassal who feels he has some agency is far more stable and productive than one who feels like a crushed subject. This calculated vagueness demonstrates a profound and cynical understanding of the psychology of power, a tool of control that feels less like a chain and more like a leash, giving the illusion of freedom while ensuring the subordinate never wanders too far. To truly appreciate the genius of Hittite diplomatic coding, we need to examine it in action, and there is no better case study than the Treaty of Kadesh. This document, etched onto a silver tablet over 3,000 years ago, is more than just the world's oldest surviving peace treaty. It is a masterclass in linguistic statecraft, a text where every word was chosen to heal a wound while securing a strategic advantage. The backdrop was a colossal clash of empires. Around 1259 BCE, the armies of Hittite king Hattusa III and Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II met at Kadesh in Syria, a battle celebrated in Egyptian propaganda as a great victory for Ramesses, but which historical evidence suggests was at best a bloody stalemate that left both empires exhausted. Neither superpower could afford a prolonged war, yet neither king could return home and admit defeat. They were trapped by the politics of pride, and the only way out was through a treaty that allowed both to claim success. This is where the Hittite scribes performed their magic. The very first thing you notice about the treaty text is what is conspicuously absent: any assignment of blame. There is no mention of who started the conflict, no recounting of battlefield losses, no admission of guilt from either side. Instead, the opening frames the entire event as a mutual decision. It states that the two great kings have chosen to establish good peace and good brotherhood from that day forward. This was a brilliant diplomatic fiction. By erasing the recent, violent past from the official record, the treaty provided a clean slate. Ramesses could avoid the humiliation of acknowledging a failed campaign, and Hattusa could present the agreement as a magnanimous offer of peace rather than a necessary compromise. The language of brotherhood, which we discussed earlier, was employed here not just as a formality, but as an essential tool for conflict resolution, transforming a fierce rival back into a respected equal with a single rhetorical stroke. But the true masterpiece of coding lies in the treaty's most famous clause, the Mutual Defense Pact. The text reads, "If another enemy comes against the lands of Ramesses, he shall send word to the Hittite king to come to his aid." On the surface, this sounds like a straightforward promise of alliance, a symbol of the new friendship between the two powers. For the Egyptian court and for public consumption, it was a powerful reassurance. Yet for the Hittite strategists, this clause was a carefully constructed shield. The key is in the conditional phrasing, "if another enemy comes against the lands of Ramesses." This wording creates a crucial distinction. The Hittites were only obligated to provide military assistance if Egypt was the victim of an unprovoked attack. This protected them from a critical risk, being dragged into one of Ramesses' own wars of expansion. Imagine if the ambitious pharaoh decided to launch an invasion south into Nubia or west into Libya. Under a simpler alliance treaty, he might have expected Hittite support, but the Treaty of Kadesh cleverly avoided this. The Hittites retained the freedom to judge each situation, ensuring they would not become unintentional participants in Egyptian aggression. This dual-purpose language achieved something remarkable. It created a public image of solidarity and mutual commitment that satisfied the political needs of both kings, while simultaneously embedding a crucial strategic safeguard for the Hittite Empire. The treaty stabilized a volatile frontier for generations, allowing both empires to turn their attention and resources to other threats. The fact that copies of the treaty were found in both the Hittite capital of Hattusa and on the walls of the Ramesseum in Egypt shows how each side propagated its own version of the agreement. For Rameses, it was a testament to his power, forcing a mighty rival to become his brother and ally. For Hattusili, it was a guarantee of security, a legal barrier that prevented future conflict without conceding any real strategic ground. The Treaty of Kadesh stands as a timeless monument to the power of words over weapons, proving that the most lasting victories in international relations are often won not on the battlefield, but in the nuanced, coded sentences of a carefully negotiated text. While treaties and oaths formed the legal backbone of the empire, another, more subtle code operated in the glittering exchange of treasures between courts. The Hittites understood that diplomacy was not conducted with words alone. It was also a language spoken through objects. The annual exchange of lavish gifts between kings was a ritual as important as any treaty signing, a calibrated system of economic and political messaging disguised as generosity. Imagine a convoy of donkeys and carts winding its way from Hattusa to the court of a neighboring king, laden with ingots of iron, a metal more precious than gold at the time, finely woven textiles, intricate gold jewelry, and even exotic animals like elephants or monkeys. To the untrained eye, this was a spectacle of royal wealth, but to the scribes and diplomats keeping careful records, every item, its quality, its quantity, and the speed of its delivery was a word in a silent conversation about power, loyalty, and expectation. The timing of a gift was its first layer of meaning. A prompt delivery of the annual tribute or a generous gift sent to celebrate a new king's coronation was a powerful reaffirmation of alliance. It signaled that the relationship was a priority, that the lines of communication were open and respected. Conversely, a delayed gift was rarely an accident of logistics. It was a deliberate signal, a quiet but unmistakable expression of displeasure or disrespect. A king who received his expected gifts months late would immediately summon his advisors to decipher the message. Was the Hittite king distracted by a rebellion elsewhere, or was this a calculated snub meant to put him in his place? Even more telling was the gift itself. Sending a gift of lesser value than in previous years, or one that was poorly crafted, was a grave diplomatic insult. It implied that the recipient was no longer worthy of the same level of investment or respect. The Hittites used this system with precision, rewarding a loyal vassal with a particularly magnificent gift, thereby encouraging continued good behavior, while sending a more modest one to a ruler whose loyalty was wavering, a silent warning to correct his course. Accompanying every gift was a letter, and the language within this text was just as carefully coded as the gift itself. These letters were masterpieces of double-speak, overflowing with flowery praise and declarations of brotherly affection that masked stark political realities. A Hittite king might write, "To my beloved brother, I send this gift from my heart so that you may know the depth of my friendship." On the surface, it's a warm, personal gesture. But the subtext, understood by both parties, was a reminder of the giver's power and the recipient's consequent obligation. The letter highlighted the wealth and reach of the Hittite Empire, able to procure such rare items, and in doing so reinforced the hierarchy. The recipient was expected to respond not only with effusive thanks but with a counter-gift of equal or greater value. This created a continuous cycle of reciprocal debt, a web of mutual obligation that bound rulers together as effectively as any legal clause. To fail to reciprocate adequately was to break the unspoken rules of the game, signaling ingratitude and potentially hostile intentions. This system of gift exchange was, in essence, a form of economic leverage. For a smaller, less wealthy vassal state, the pressure to produce a counter-gift that could match the splendor of what arrived from Hattusa could be immense. It forced them to divert significant resources into crafting luxury goods or mining precious metals, resources that might otherwise have been used to strengthen their own military or infrastructure. This subtly drained the vassals' treasury, making them more dependent on the empire and less capable of financing a rebellion. For dealings with equal powers like Egypt, the gift exchange became a peaceful arena for competition. Each side sought to impress the other with their wealth and sophistication, a battle of one-upmanship fought with gold and ivory instead of swords. The language surrounding these exchanges, so full of praise and affection, was the velvet glove covering the iron fist of economic and political strategy. It demonstrated that in the Hittite world, even an act of apparent generosity could be a sophisticated tool of control, weaving material wealth directly into the linguistic and diplomatic fabric that held the empire together. But in this world of carefully inscribed clay, the written word was only half the story. The true lifeblood of Hittite diplomacy flowed along dusty roads and mountain passes, carried not by wires or signals, but by living, breathing men. The messenger was the indispensable link, the human pulse of the empire's communication network. To dismiss these envoys as simple couriers would be to completely misunderstand the system. They were far more than postmen. They were highly trusted extensions of the king's own authority, selected for their loyalty, intelligence, and formidable memory. While they carried the official clay tablet, their most sensitive cargo was often stored not in a pouch, but in their minds. It was common practice for a messenger to memorize a separate set of secret verbal instructions, a confidential addendum meant only for the recipient's ears. This oral component was the ultimate safeguard, ensuring that if the tablet was lost or intercepted, its most critical meanings would remain secure, locked away in the memory of a single, reliable individual. The performance of delivery was itself a critical part of the message. Every aspect of a messenger's arrival was scrutinized for hidden meaning. A Hittite envoy galloping into a foreign court on a lathered horse, his clothes stained with dust from a non-stop journey, was communicating a powerful sense of urgency before he even uttered a word. The very speed of his travel screamed that the matter was one of immediate, grave importance, perhaps a rebellion or an imminent invasion. Conversely, a messenger who took a leisurely pace, stopping at towns along the way and arriving well-rested and composed, was sending an equally clear, if opposite, signal. A deliberately slow journey could be a calculated sign of the king's displeasure, a way of showing that the recipient was not a high priority, or that the sender was so confident in his power that he felt no need to rush. The messenger's demeanor upon arrival, whether he was respectful, haughty, or nervous, was also passed for clues about the sender's emotional state and intentions. Once in the presence of the recipient king, the messenger's role shifted from carrier to active interpreter. He was not simply to hand over the tablet and leave. He was expected to be able to answer questions, clarify ambiguities, and provide the vital context that cold cuneiform could not convey. A scribe reading the tablet might note a particular turn of phrase. The messenger could explain the subtle emphasis the king had placed on that very word during his instructions. If the recipient's own advisors challenged a point, the messenger was trained to defend his king's position with persuasive arguments, acting as a live, thinking representative of Hittite interests. This required a deep understanding of the political situation, a quick wit, and immense personal courage. He was walking into the lion's den, often alone, and his ability to perform under pressure could mean the difference between peace and war. The treatment of these messengers was a direct reflection of the relationship between the two courts. A universal, if unwritten, diplomatic protocol guaranteed their safety, treating them as inviolable representatives. To harm a messenger was considered one of the most heinous acts imaginable, an offense against the gods and the very principles of civilized interaction. But within the bounds of safety, there was immense room for nuance. Honoring a messenger with a lavish feast, fine lodging, and gifts to carry home was a powerful signal of respect for the sender and a desire for positive relations. Conversely, making a messenger wait for days for an audience, housing him in modest quarters, or offering him meager provisions was a deliberate and unmistakable insult, a way for a host king to express his contempt or anger without breaking diplomatic norms. The messenger's body and his experience became the canvas upon which these subtle, unspoken messages were painted. This human element introduced a layer of risk and unpredictability that pure text could never replicate, reminding us that in the ancient world, diplomacy was a high-stakes performance where every gesture, every pause, and every tone of voice carried the weight of empires. And so we arrive at one of the most chillingly effective codes in the Hittite diplomatic arsenal, a maneuver that weaponized the most fundamental of human bonds, the relationship between parent and child. The practice seemed, on its surface, to be the highest honor a vassal king could receive. After a period of unrest or as a pledge of future loyalty, the great king in Hattusa would extend a gracious invitation. He would propose to adopt the vassal's son, to bring the young prince to the imperial capital, and raise him within the splendor of the royal court. In the official correspondence, this was framed as an act of profound trust and integration. The vassal's lineage would be woven into the very fabric of the ruling family, his son educated alongside Hittite princes, learning the ways of empire firsthand. The language used to describe this arrangement was dripping with familial affection. The Hittite king would refer to the boy as his son and speak of the vassal as his brother, creating a powerful fiction of a united family. For a local ruler on the periphery of the empire, this could feel like an incredible opportunity, a chance for his bloodline to gain unparalleled prestige and influence. But behind this warm facade lay a cold, brutal reality. The prince was not a guest, he was a hostage. His presence in Hattusa was the ultimate guarantee of his father's unwavering good behavior. The affectionate term son was, in truth, a euphemism for collateral. The entire arrangement was a masterstroke of political coercion, disguised as a benevolent act of kinship. The vassal king, now called brother, was trapped in a terrible dilemma. Any thought of rebellion, any hesitation in sending his annual tribute, any clandestine communication with a Hittite rival would immediately place his child's life in mortal danger. The unspoken threat was absolute. Loyalty meant your son lived a life of luxury, being groomed for a future of privilege. Betrayal meant his certain execution. This code forced a father to weigh the ambitions of his kingdom against the life of his own child, a psychological pressure that few could withstand. The brilliance and the horror of this system was its complete inversion of emotional language. The Hittite scribes crafted letters that overflowed with concern for the boy's well-being. A typical message might read, "Do not worry for your son, my brother. He is in good health and shows great promise in his studies. He asks after you often, and we tell him of your great loyalty." Every sentence is a masterpiece of double meaning. The report on his health is both a reassurance and a reminder that his welfare is entirely in Hittite hands. The mention of his great promise hints at a bright future contingent on the father's continued compliance. The emphasis on loyalty is the sharp point of the spear, gently pressed against the vassal's throat. The language is so personal, so intimate, that it makes the underlying threat even more potent. To reject the fiction, to accuse the Hittite king of hostage-taking, would be to shatter the carefully constructed relationship and invite immediate retribution. The vassal was compelled to participate in the charade, responding with grateful letters that masked his own fear and powerlessness. This practice reveals the dark heart of Hittite power politics. It demonstrates a cynical understanding that the most effective chains are not forged from iron, but from love and fear. By framing an act of pure realpolitik in the language of family, the Hittites made submission feel like an honor and coercion feel like an invitation. It was a betrayal embedded at the very core of a promised bond, a strategy that ensured control not through the constant threat of invasion, but through the constant, gnawing anxiety in a father's heart. The son, raised in gilded captivity, often became a perfect tool for the empire in his own right. Should his father prove disloyal and be removed, this now Hittite-educated prince could be installed as the new, reliably pro-Hittite ruler, seamlessly continuing the empire's influence. Thus, the code of familial betrayal was a self-perpetuating system, a chillingly efficient machine that used the language of love to guarantee the endurance of power. Even the most routine communication held layers of hidden meaning for the Hittite diplomat, and nowhere was this more concentrated than in the seemingly simple greetings and farewells that framed every letter. Imagine a scribe in Hattusa beginning a new tablet. His first task was not to deliver the core message, but to craft the salutation, a formulaic string of words that an untrained eye might dismiss as mere politeness. A standard opening might read, "Say to my brother, the king, thus says your brother, the king, may the gods keep you well." To us, this sounds like ancient formalities, but to the recipient's own team of scribes, this opening paragraph was a dense field of coded signals, each word a potential clue to the sender's true intentions and emotional state. They understood that the real conversation often began not with the demand or promise that followed, but with the subtle deviations from the expected script. A scribe's primary skill was knowing the rules so perfectly that he could break them with surgical precision to send a message without ever stating it outright. Consider the powerful implication of a single omission. The standard wish for the recipient's good health, "May the gods keep you well," was not just a pleasantry, it was a fundamental component of diplomatic respect. To leave it out was a deliberate and unmistakable act. A letter that began abruptly without this divine blessing was the equivalent of a modern diplomat refusing a handshake. It signaled coldness, displeasure, or a deliberate downgrading of the relationship. The message was clear. The sender was so aggrieved that he would not even invoke the gods on the other king's behalf. Conversely, expanding the salutation could be equally telling. If a scribe, under instruction, added a longer list of deities, "May the storm god, the sun goddess of Arena, and all the gods of Hatti keep you well," he was doing more than being pious. He was amplifying the bond, suggesting a stronger, more divinely sanctioned connection. This was a way to butter up an ally before making a significant request or to soothe tensions after a period of strain. The pantheon itself became a tool for calibrating the warmth of a relationship. The order of names was another battlefield of protocol, especially in correspondence between rulers who considered themselves equals. When a treaty involved multiple kings, the sequence in which they were listed was a matter of intense negotiation and scrutiny. Being named first was a public acknowledgement of primacy, a slight elevation in status that could be a significant propaganda victory. A Hittite king might insist on his name preceding that of the pharaoh of Egypt, and the Egyptian scribes would undoubtedly push back with their own claim. The final order reached in an agreement was a carefully brokered compromise, a frozen snapshot of the current balance of power. If a subsequent letter from one court to the other subtly altered this agreed-upon order, it was a deliberate provocation, a quiet way to test boundaries or express a shifting perception of the hierarchy. The closing formulas were just as nuanced. A standard ending might wish for 1,000 gods to protect the recipient, but a warmer, more personal closing could hint at a genuine friendship or a desire to deepen the alliance, while a curt, perfunctory sign-off could speak volumes about underlying friction. This intense focus on every syllable of the greeting meant that drafting a simple salutation could be a time-consuming and high-stakes process. A senior scribe would not delegate this task to a junior apprentice. He would ponder the precise phrasing, weighing the potential interpretations of each word against the king's strategic goals. He knew that on the other end, in a rival court, another skilled scribe would be performing the same analysis in reverse, scanning the opening lines for any deviation from the norm that might reveal the sender's true feelings. This was a silent duel of wits conducted across hundreds of miles, a game of diplomatic chess where the first move was a seemingly innocuous wish for good health. The fact that such immense intellectual energy was poured into these formalities reveals a profound truth about Hittite diplomacy. There was no such thing as a neutral word. Every element of communication, from the grandest treaty clause to the most routine greeting, was a potential carrier of coded meaning, a testament to a world where power was expressed not only through armies but through the masterful manipulation of language itself. Beyond the careful legalisms of treaties and the psychological pressure of hostage-taking, the Hittites wielded a code of even greater scope and power, one that reached into the heavens themselves to justify their rule on earth. This was the relentless propaganda of divine favor, a strategy that framed the entire Hittite Empire not as a human creation but as the manifest will of the gods. At the heart of this claim stood the mighty storm god Teshub, the wielder of thunder and lightning, who was presented as the personal patron and divine father of the Hittite king. This was not a vague spiritual connection, it was a direct line of celestial authority. The king was not merely a political leader, he was the chief priest of the land, the supreme intermediary between the people and the pantheon. His successes on the battlefield and his wisdom in governance were therefore portrayed not as personal achievements, but as tangible proof of the gods' active endorsement. Every military victory, every successful harvest, every period of stability was retroactively framed as evidence of this sacred partnership, creating a powerful, self-reinforcing narrative of legitimacy. This theological framework was actively injected into the bloodstream of international diplomacy. A Hittite king writing to a rival or a restless vassal would frequently lace his correspondence with declarations of divine support. A phrase like, "The sun goddess of Arena, my lady, has delivered my enemies into my hand," was a masterful piece of coded communication. On a surface level, it was a simple statement of fact, an explanation for a recent military success. But for the recipient, the subtext was a chilling threat. It implied that any army that marched against the Hittites was not just confronting human soldiers, but was positioning itself against the divine forces of the universe. To resist the Hittite king was to risk blasphemy, to invite the active wrath of 1,000 gods. This turned political and military opposition into a theological crime, a potent demoralizing tool that could sow doubt and fear in the hearts of even the most confident adversaries. Why would the gods grant victory to someone opposing their chosen instrument? The practical application of this code extended to the very rituals of kingship, which were designed for public spectacle. Grand religious festivals like the annual Pureuli festival celebrating the myth of the slaying of the dragon were not just acts of worship, they were massive state-sponsored events where the king played the central role, reenacting the deeds of the gods and visually demonstrating his unique relationship with them. Foreign ambassadors and vassal rulers invited to witness these spectacles would be overwhelmed by the pageantry, the sheer scale of the devotion, and the king's position at its apex. The message was unmistakable. The power you see in this palace, the armies you fear, are all sanctioned by a higher authority. This was soft power of the most effective kind, making the Hittite state appear eternal, ordained, and fundamentally unassailable. Challenging, it seemed not just difficult but unnatural. This claim to exclusive divine favor also created a powerful tool for explaining failure and maintaining control during crises. If a Hittite army suffered a defeat, the blame could be shifted away from the king or his generals. The official explanation would often be that the people, or perhaps a specific disloyal vassal, had angered the gods through some ritual impurity or broken oath. The military setback was then framed not as a failure of Hittite strategy, but as a divine punishment that required atonement from the guilty parties. This cleverly insulated the central authority from criticism and redirected popular discontent outward, often toward external scapegoats or internal sinners who needed to be purged to restore the gods' favor. It was a circular logic that protected the king's legitimacy no matter the outcome. Victory proved the gods were pleased, and defeat proved that someone else had displeased them, requiring the king to lead a corrective campaign to regain their support. Ultimately, this intertwining of religion and politics meant that every diplomatic negotiation, every threat, and every promise occurred within a theological arena. A border dispute was not just about land, it was about which king enjoyed the support of the local deity. A demand for tribute was framed as fulfilling a divine obligation, not just a political one. By making the gods silent partners in all their statecraft, the Hittites elevated their earthly ambitions to a cosmic plane. Their diplomatic language became saturated with this spiritual certainty, allowing them to present their imperial expansion not as raw ambition, but as the unfolding of a sacred destiny. This code provided an unshakable foundation for their authority, a narrative so powerful that it persuaded not only their subjects and rivals, but likely the Hittite elite themselves that their empire was a divine project, making its preservation a holy duty. While Hattusa provides the imperial perspective, the true complexity of this diplomatic web comes into sharp focus when we shift our gaze to the Syrian coast, to the bustling port city of Ugarit. As a wealthy and strategically vital vassal of the Hittite Empire, Ugarit was far more than just a tribute-paying subject. Its location made it a natural crossroads for trade and, consequently, for information. The archives discovered here offer a breathtakingly detailed, street-level view of ancient intelligence operations, revealing a world where espionage was a routine part of statecraft. Unlike the central archives of Hattusa, which largely reflect the official outgoing messages of the Hittite court, the clay tablets of Ugarit present a cacophony of voices. In a single administrative building, archaeologists found letters from the Hittite great king sitting side by side with correspondence from the pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Assyria, and rulers of smaller city-states across the Near East. This was not an accident of poor filing. It was the natural result of Ugarit's role as an international listening post, a place where the secret codes of every major power converged and were actively dissected. Imagine the scene in the scriptorium of the Ugaritic palace. A senior scribe, fluent not only in his own native language but also in Akkadian and perhaps Hurrian, would carefully unroll a newly arrived clay letter, its surface still dusty from the caravan route. His task was not merely to translate the words for his king. He was a cryptographer trained to analyze the subtext, to read the hidden messages encoded in the formal greetings and subtle phrasings. A letter from the Egyptian court to the king of Ugarit, for instance, might be filled with warm assurances of friendship, but the Ugaritic scribe's job was to compare its tone and promises with the latest directive from his Hittite overlord. Was Egypt's offer of trade a genuine gesture, or was it a carefully veiled attempt to pull Ugarit out of the Hittite sphere of influence? The scribe would note any deviation from standard diplomatic formulas, any unusual emphasis on a particular phrase, any hint of a promise that contradicted the terms of Ugarit's vassal treaty with Hattusa. His analysis would then be compiled into a confidential report, sent back to the Hittite capital, providing the imperial government with real-time intelligence on the political maneuvers of its rivals. This placed the rulers and officials of Ugarit in an incredibly delicate position. They were legally and morally bound to their Hittite suzerain by sacred oaths, yet they were constantly being courted by other great powers who saw Ugarit's wealth and strategic harbor as a valuable prize. The city's scribes had to become masters of a dangerous double game. Officially, they served their king, who served the Hittite emperor, but unofficially, they had to navigate a landscape of competing demands and tempting offers. They might be tasked with drafting a perfectly loyal response to the Hittite king, while simultaneously composing a more ambiguous, non-committal reply to an Egyptian proposition. A reply carefully worded to avoid giving offense while also avoiding any concrete commitment. This required a level of linguistic dexterity that is almost unimaginable. A single poorly chosen word, a mistranslated nuance, or a misjudgment of a rival's intent could be misinterpreted as treachery by the Hittites or as rejection by the Egyptians, potentially plunging the city into a devastating conflict. The archive of Ugarit thus transforms our understanding of Hittite diplomacy from a one-way street of imperial command into a dynamic, multi-player chess game. It shows that the secret language was not a static code used only by the Hittites, but a living, evolving system of communication that every state was trying to manipulate for its own advantage. The king of Ugarit himself was not a passive puppet. He was an active player, using his city's unique position to play the great powers off against each other, always seeking to maximize his own autonomy and security. His scribes were his most important pieces in this game, their linguistic skills his primary defense against being crushed between the imperial ambitions of his much larger neighbors. The tablets from Ugarit are the scorecard of this high-stakes game, recording not just what was said, but the immense effort that went into deciphering what was truly meant, revealing a world where survival depended on the ability to hear the whisper of betrayal beneath the shouted words of brotherhood. Of all the tools in the Hittite diplomatic arsenal, perhaps none was more personal or more coldly calculated than the strategic use of marriage. This was not a matter of royal romance or dynasty building alone. It was a sophisticated and deliberate form of foreign policy, a living treaty sealed not just on clay but in flesh and blood. When a Hittite princess was sent from the highlands of Anatolia to marry a king in a distant land, she was far more than a bride. She was a permanent diplomatic mission of one, a physical embodiment of the Hittite Empire's power and interests, installed directly within the inner sanctum of a rival or vassal court. Her journey was preceded by one of the most detailed legal documents the Hittite scribes ever produced, a marriage treaty that functioned as an operator's manual for this new, human piece of imperial machinery. This treaty did not concern itself with love or companionship. Instead, it was a masterwork of political engineering, a code designed to protect the princess and, through her, the empire for generations to come. The language of these treaties was relentlessly precise, leaving nothing to chance or the whims of her new husband. First and foremost, it defined her status with absolute clarity. A standard clause would explicitly state that she was to be the principal wife, the queen above all others. A phrase like, "She shall not be made secondary to any other woman," was a direct assertion of Hittite influence, ensuring that no local favorite could usurp her position and diminish her access to the king's ear. This was crucial because her primary role was that of a channel of communication and a constant reminder of Hattusa's reach. The treaty guaranteed her the right to maintain contact with her homeland, meaning she could receive messengers and send reports back to her father or brother, the great king. She was, in effect, a highly placed intelligence asset, her letters providing an insider's view of the court's politics, its ambitions, and its potential treacheries. Her household staff would often include trusted officials from Hattusa, creating a small, loyal Hittite enclave within the very heart of a foreign palace. But the treaty's true genius lay in its long-term planning, focusing intently on the children she would bear. The succession rights of her sons were negotiated with the meticulous care of a corporate merger. The treaty would legally bind the foreign king to recognize her firstborn son as his heir apparent. This was the ultimate goal of the alliance, to place a ruler on a neighboring throne who was half Hittite, who had been raised with at least some connection to the imperial court, and whose legitimacy was intrinsically tied to his maternal lineage. This created a powerful bond that could last for decades, transforming a vassal state bound by fear into an allied kingdom led by family. Of course, the foreign king often had other sons from previous marriages or lesser wives, and these half-brothers would naturally pose a threat. The marriage treaty would therefore include clauses demanding that the king suppress any rival claims and protect the Hittite princess's son from internal plots. The entire agreement was designed to project Hittite power into the future, securing influence not just for the current generation, but for the one to follow. This intricate system, however, was fragile. The personal was inextricably linked to the political, and the failure of a marriage alliance was never treated as a simple domestic tragedy. If a foreign king mistreated his Hittite wife, if he demoted her, harmed her, or set aside her son in favor of another heir, it was not seen as a personal insult. In the coded language of Hittite diplomacy, it was framed as a violation of a sacred oath. The marriage treaty was sworn before the gods, and to break its terms was an act of impiety. This provided the Hittite king with a powerful legal and moral pretext for military intervention. A campaign launched to avenge a dishonored sister or daughter could be presented to the world not as raw aggression, but as a righteous punishment for blasphemy and oath-breaking. The language used in such a declaration would be heavy with religious fury, portraying the Hittite army as the instrument of divine will, sent to chastise a king who had betrayed the gods themselves. This transformation of a personal grievance into a casus belli demonstrates the chilling efficiency of the code. It turned the most intimate of human relationships into a tripwire for war, ensuring that every king who welcomed a Hittite princess into his bed knew he was also welcoming the entire Hittite army to his doorstep if he failed to honor the terms. Yet for all its sophistication, the intricate system of Hittite diplomacy possessed a fatal flaw. It was built for a world that was stable and predictable. Its complex codes of brotherhood, its veiled threats, and its sacred oaths all functioned within a recognized international order, a club of great kingdoms like Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon that played by a shared set of rules. Then, around 1200 BCE, that world shattered. The event we now call the Late Bronze Age collapse was not a single war but a catastrophic systems failure. a domino effect of invasions, famines, rebellions, and mass migrations that swept across the eastern Mediterranean like a tsunami. In this maelstrom, the Hittite Empire, along with nearly every other major civilization of the era, simply vanished. The sophisticated diplomatic language that had held the empire together for centuries did not just fade away, it was rendered instantly, utterly obsolete. The network of messengers found their routes cut by marauders and collapsed states. The vassal treaties, so carefully inscribed on clay, became meaningless when the royal authority that enforced them no longer existed. The elaborate gift exchanges ceased as palaces burned and trade routes disintegrated. The codes that had maintained order became a silent, dead language almost overnight. The archaeological evidence from the capital, Hattusa, is chillingly final. The city was not simply abandoned, it was systematically burned and destroyed. The grand temples, the administrative buildings housing the vast archives, all were consumed by a massive fire. This was not the result of a simple accident or a random attack. The intentional destruction of the central nervous system of the empire signals a definitive end. The invaders, whoever they were, understood that to break the Hittites, they had to destroy not just their army but their very means of governance. In the smoldering ruins, the 30,000 clay tablets were baked hard by the inferno, paradoxically preserving them for millennia but also freezing a moment of absolute terminus. The last messages sent from Hattusa were likely desperate pleas for help or frantic military orders that never reached their destination. The silence that fell after the city's destruction was absolute. The diplomatic codes, which had once hummed with life across the Anatolian plateau, fell silent forever. This dramatic end forces us to confront a difficult question. Was the collapse of the Hittite Empire a failure of their diplomatic system, or was that system merely a helpless victim of forces beyond its control? Some historians argue that the very rigidity of the Hittite bureaucratic and diplomatic machine may have contributed to its inability to respond to a crisis of such unprecedented scale. The system was designed to manage known quantities, a rebellious vassal king, a territorial dispute with Egypt, a bad harvest. It operated on a timescale of seasons and years, with messengers taking weeks to deliver their coded tablets. But the threats that emerged at the end of the Bronze Age were different. They were fast-moving, unpredictable, and recognized no established rules of engagement. The mysterious coalition known as the Sea Peoples, for instance, was not a state that could be reasoned with through treaties or bound by oaths to gods they did not worship. They were a force of chaos that operated outside the entire framework of Hittite statecraft. How do you send a veiled threat to an enemy who has no capital city? How do you negotiate a marriage alliance with a leader whose identity is unknown? The Hittite playbook had no answers. In this light, the empire's reliance on its intricate codes may have been a liability. The time-consuming process of drafting perfectly nuanced letters, securing agreements with vassals, and organizing ceremonial gift exchanges required a stable backdrop. When that backdrop disintegrated into widespread famine and social unrest, the machinery of diplomacy was too slow and too delicate to function. A local governor facing a mob of starving citizens and rumors of approaching raiders had no use for a clay tablet from a distant capital reminding him of his oath of loyalty. Survival instinct trumped diplomatic protocol. The system, so effective in maintaining peace among civilized powers, was completely unequipped for a collapse of civilization itself. The codes were a superb tool for gardening in a well-tended park, but they were useless when the entire forest caught fire. The fall of the Hittite Empire is therefore a profound lesson in the limits of soft power. It demonstrates that the most elaborate and sophisticated systems of communication, negotiation, and control are ultimately dependent on a basic foundation of security and stability. When that foundation crumbles, language alone cannot hold back the tide. The Hittites had mastered the art of ruling through words, but they could not words their way out of a catastrophe that destroyed the very world those words were designed to describe. Their story is a sobering reminder that diplomacy is not a substitute for resilience. It is a product of it. The silence that followed their fall echoes through history, a testament to the fragility of even the greatest empires and the sobering truth that no code, however clever, can ultimately withstand the overwhelming force of historical change. But while the codes of brotherhood and divine curses governed relationships, and the strategic ambiguity of vassal treaties maintained a flexible grip on power, the Hittite Empire's most fundamental claim was to the land itself. This brings us to a code of breathtakingly dry yet vital importance, the legalistic precision of border descriptions. In a world where a kingdom's wealth and security were measured in acres and access to trade routes, defining territory with absolute clarity was not just a bureaucratic exercise, it was an existential necessity. A vague border was an invitation to conflict, a fertile ground for future wars. The Hittite scribes, therefore, approached the task of mapping their domain with the meticulous care of master cartographers, using words instead of lines on a page to etch their authority directly onto the landscape. Their tool of choice was not a simple from here to there, but a rich tapestry of specific, observable, and enduring natural landmarks. Imagine a scribe, perhaps having traveled for days with a royal delegation, standing at the edge of a disputed territory. His job was to translate the features before him: a winding river, a distinctive mountain peak, an ancient, gnarled oak tree, into legally binding language. A typical border clause from a Hittite treaty might read something like, "The border shall run from the city of Zippalander to the great mountain of Harana. Then it shall follow the course of the river Sheharia southward until the black rock of the god Perwa, and from that rock in a straight line to the great oak tree that stands alone on the ridge." This is not poetic flourish, it is a chain of evidence. Each point in the description is a node in an unbreakable verbal fence. By using features that would be recognizable to any local inhabitant, the Hittites ensured that the border was not an abstract idea debated in distant palaces, but a tangible reality known to the farmers, shepherds, and merchants who lived there. A farmer grazing his sheep would know precisely which side of the black rock of Perwa he was on, and therefore under whose jurisdiction he fell. This verbal mapping was a powerful code of possession. Every time a Hittite official or a vassal king recited the terms of the treaty, they were performing a ritual of ownership, speaking the empire into existence across hills and valleys. The language was deliberately dry and technical to strip away any potential for emotional or subjective interpretation. There is no room for "the lands near the pretty forest" or "the territory up to where we usually hunt." The goal was to create a description so precise that it would be nearly impossible to dispute in good faith. This legalistic approach highlights a core Hittite obsession with order and the rule of law. Their empire was not a chaotic, rapacious conquest. It was a system, and the borders were the definitive lines of that system. By defining their territory with such painstaking accuracy, they were projecting an image of permanence, stability, and unassailable legal authority. The process of establishing a border was itself a ceremonial act that turned words into reality. After the treaty was drafted in the capital, a delegation comprising Hittite officials, scribes, and representatives from the other signatory power would physically travel the proposed boundary line. They would walk from landmark to landmark, formally acknowledging each one in turn. At the great mountain of Harana, they might make a small sacrifice or set up a stone marker. At the riverbank, they would note the specific bend described in the text. This journey was a crucial piece of political theater. It was a public demonstration of the treaty's power, witnessed by the local population and symbolically by the gods. The scribes present were not just observers, they were auditors, ensuring that the physical world matched the description on the clay tablet. This act of verification transformed the abstract legal language into a concrete, mutually acknowledged fact on the ground. Any future ruler who tried to move the border would not merely be breaking a treaty, he would be denying a reality that had been formally witnessed and sanctified. This meticulous attention to territorial definition reveals how the Hittite diplomatic code extended its reach to the very soil they ruled. It was the ultimate expression of their desire to impose order on a complex world. While the language of brotherhood managed relationships between kings, and the language of curses managed the spiritual consequences of betrayal, the language of borders managed the dirt and stone that constituted the empire itself. It was a code that dealt in the most fundamental asset of any ancient state, land. And in its dry, unadorned specificity, we find not boredom, but the quiet, relentless engine of imperial control, ensuring that everyone, from the great king in Hattusa to the humble farmer in a frontier valley, knew exactly where the power of the Hittites began and where it ended. It is a remarkable thought that a Hittite scribe from the 13th century BC would likely feel right at home reading the text of a modern United Nations Security Council resolution or a bilateral trade agreement. The core DNA of diplomatic language, it turns out, has proven incredibly resilient. While the clay tablets have been replaced by PDFs and the chariots by fighter jets, the fundamental strategies of coded communication that the Hittites perfected are still the lifeblood of international relations today. That seemingly innocuous term, strategic partnership, so common in contemporary diplomatic communiques, is the direct descendant of the Hittite Brotherhood. When two nations today declare a strategic partnership, it rarely signifies a true, automatic military alliance. Instead, much like the Hittite fiction of familial bonds, it creates a public framework for cooperation that can mean anything from frequent high-level meetings to modest trade deals, all while carefully avoiding any legally binding commitments to come to the other's defense. It is a phrase designed to signal warmth without the heat of obligation, allowing rival powers to explore areas of mutual interest without alarming their other allies. A diplomatic tightrope walk that would have been perfectly understood in Hattusa. The Hittite genius for strategic ambiguity lives on in the most contentious clauses of modern treaties, where vagueness is not a flaw but a necessary feature for achieving consensus. Consider the painstaking negotiations over climate change agreements. Final texts are often littered with deliberately softened language, should instead of shall, aim to instead of will, and timelines that are aspirational rather than mandatory. This is not a sign of failure, it is a calculated diplomatic tool. It allows each nation to return home and present the agreement as a victory, interpreting the ambiguous clauses in a way that suits their domestic political landscape. Just as a Hittite vassal could interpret customary aid to mean a manageable contribution while the suzerain could later redefine it as a major demand, a modern nation can hail its commitment to net zero emissions while leaving the most difficult details of implementation for future negotiations. This ambiguity is the grease that allows the wheels of international diplomacy to turn, making agreement possible among parties with vastly different interests and capabilities. Even the ancient practice of gift-giving, so central to Hittite economic leverage, has its clear parallel in today's foreign aid and development loans. When a major power provides billions in aid or infrastructure investment to a smaller nation, the public language is one of generosity, solidarity, and shared development goals. Yet, just like the Hittite king's shipment of gold and iron, these modern gifts are rarely without strings. They can be used to secure voting alignment in international organizations, gain access to strategic ports or military bases, or create a cycle of economic dependency that ensures the recipient's long-term loyalty. The timing of aid disbursements can be used as a lever, accelerated to reward a favorable policy decision or delayed to express disapproval, mirroring exactly how a delayed Hittite tribute gift would signal coldness. The flowery language of cooperation and mutual benefit continues to mask the hard realities of political and economic influence, a testament to the enduring power of material exchange as a tool of statecraft. And what of the Hittite messenger whose safety was guaranteed by sacred protocol? His modern equivalent is the diplomat enjoying immunity under the Vienna Convention. This principle, which protects envoys from arrest and prosecution in their host country, is a direct legacy of ancient practices that recognized the necessity of secure communication channels. Without this protection, diplomacy would be impossible. Every envoy would be a potential hostage, and no sensitive message could be delivered. The treatment of these diplomats remains a key barometer of relations, just as it was 3,000 years ago. Expelling a certain number of diplomats is a calibrated insult, a way to express severe displeasure without resorting to military action, while rolling out the red carpet for a visiting ambassador is a clear signal of respect and a desire for warmer ties. The human element of performance and perception in diplomacy is as critical now as it was then. Perhaps the most profound parallel lies in the use of historical narrative as a tool of justification. The Hittites were masters of this, using treaty preambles to recount past favors or betrayals to legitimize their current demands. Modern states employ this same tactic with relentless precision. A nation seeking to justify a controversial foreign policy decision will invariably release a white paper or a series of speeches that construct a selective historical narrative, presenting the action as the inevitable and righteous consequence of past events. This framing is designed to shape the perception of the international community, turning a complex geopolitical maneuver into a simple story of grievance and response, of provocation and necessary reaction. By controlling the narrative, a state seeks to claim the moral high ground, much like a Hittite king invoking the god's support after a military campaign. The goal is to make their preferred outcome seem not just strategically sound, but historically and even morally justified. This enduring relevance of Hittite techniques reveals a fundamental truth about international relations. The game of power is ultimately a human game played out on a global stage. The instincts for self-preservation, the desire for advantage, the need to save face, and the tools of persuasion and deception are constants of the human condition. The Hittites, in their brilliance, simply systemized these instincts into a formal language of statecraft. They understood that words are the first and last weapon of empire, capable of preventing wars, securing riches, and building legends. By studying their codes, we are not just learning about ancient history, we are acquiring a lens through which to decode the headlines of our own time. The next time you read about a strategic dialogue, a non-paper, or a frank and constructive meeting between world leaders, listen carefully. You might just hear the faint, deliberate whisper of a Hittite scribe, reminding us that while the technology has transformed, the ancient art of speaking peace while preparing for every eventuality remains very much alive. But beyond the public ceremonies and the flowery language of treaties lay a shadow world, a realm where the Hittite Empire's survival depended not on oaths but on secrets. This was the domain of the Ninth Code, the language of intelligence and deception, a system built on whispers, coded messages, and deliberate lies. The Hittites understood that to rely solely on the official proclamations of rival courts was to navigate a battlefield blindfolded. To truly secure their empire, they needed eyes and ears everywhere, and they built extensive networks of informants that stretched from the palaces of Egypt to the remote mountain forts of their northern frontiers. The reports these agents sent back were masterpieces of cautious phrasing, written in what we would now call a code of plausible deniability. A spy's message would never begin with "I, your agent in the Egyptian court, have learned." Instead, it would artfully attribute its information to anonymous third parties. A typical report might state, "Merchants arriving from the south speak of many troops gathering near the border," or "Travelers on the road from Carchemish report hearing rumors of the king's illness." This careful language served two vital purposes. First, it protected the source. If the clay tablet was intercepted by the wrong people, there was no direct confession of espionage. Second, it allowed the Hittite king himself a layer of insulation. If confronted by an angry Egyptian ambassador about these allegations, the king could shrug and truthfully say he was merely relaying unconfirmed gossip heard from itinerant merchants, a practice any ruler might engage in. The message could be acted upon with urgency in the war room, while being publicly dismissed as mere rumor in the throne room. This culture of misinformation was not limited to passive intelligence gathering. It extended into active, strategic deception. The Hittites were not above sending deliberately misleading letters to manipulate their enemies, turning the diplomatic pouch into a delivery system for traps. Perhaps the most famous example of this comes from the events leading up to the Great Battle of Kadesh. Historical evidence suggests that the Hittites may have spread false information about the location and morale of their main army, feigning weakness and distance to lure the confident pharaoh Ramesses II into a vulnerable position. A carefully crafted letter, perhaps purporting to be from a disloyal Hittite officer or a fearful vassal, would have reached the Egyptian camp, confirming Ramesses' belief that his victory was assured. This was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. The deception had to be exquisitely calibrated. The lie needed to be believable enough to be effective, tailored to the expectations and prejudices of the enemy commander. An offer that was too good to be true would arouse suspicion, but the lie also could not be so blatant that, once discovered, it would completely destroy the Hittites' credibility for all future negotiations. They had to preserve just enough trust so that their diplomatic channels remained open, even as they were poisoning them with falsehoods. It was a delicate dance on a knife's edge, where a single misstep could lead not only to military defeat but to permanent diplomatic isolation. This embrace of espionage reveals the multi-layered nature of the Hittite game. Official diplomacy, with its brotherhood and sacred oaths, was the polished surface, the public face of empire. But underneath flowed a murky undercurrent of intrigue where truth was entirely flexible. A Hittite king had to be able to think on at least two levels simultaneously. He would be composing a warm, familial letter to his brother, the pharaoh, inquiring after his health and the well-being of his children, while simultaneously approving a covert operation to bribe the pharaoh's court officials for inside information. This was not necessarily seen as hypocrisy in the modern sense. It was simply the necessary toolkit for survival in a brutal, competitive world. The ultimate goal was always the same: to gain an advantage, to secure the empire, and to confound their rivals. Whether this was achieved through a solemn treaty or a clever ruse was a matter of strategic choice, not moral principle. The language of deception was therefore just as formalized and nuanced as the language of diplomacy. It had its own rules, its own risks, and its own masters. The shadowy advisors and spy masters who understood that in the game of empires, What your enemy doesn't know is often far more important than what you have promised him in writing. In the high-stakes theater of Hittite statecraft, sometimes the most powerful message was not a declaration of war, but a masterfully delivered insult, a subtle dart aimed with precision to wound pride rather than territory. This practice was a delicate art form, a way to express profound displeasure while keeping one foot firmly planted within the bounds of diplomatic protocol. It was the equivalent of a modern diplomatic démarche or a frosty statement read out by a press secretary, a clear signal of discontent that stopped short of an irrevocable break. The genius of this system lay in its plausible deniability. A Hittite king could always claim that a delayed gift was a simple logistical error, or that a slight variation in a title was an innocent scribble mistake. But everyone involved, from the sending scribe to the receiving king and his advisors, understood the true meaning. This was a language of nuance where the space between the lines spoke louder than the words themselves. One of the most common and potent methods of delivering a coded insult was through the manipulation of titles and forms of address. In a world obsessed with hierarchy and honor, how you named someone was a direct reflection of how you viewed them. A fellow great king, like the Pharaoh of Egypt, was always entitled to the full, respectful address. But if relations began to sour, a Hittite scribe, under strict orders, might begin to employ a subtly diminished title. Instead of the great king, the hero, beloved of the storm god, a letter might address the recipient simply as the king, omitting the grand epithets that affirmed his equal status. To an outsider, this might seem trivial, but within the intricate code of royal correspondence, it was a glaring snub, a deliberate act of disrespect meant to question the recipient's power and prestige. It was a way of saying, "I no longer consider you my peer," without ever having to utter those incendiary words directly. The recipient's own scribes would immediately spot the omission and report it to their master, igniting a crisis of protocol that could ripple through the entire court. Beyond titles, the rhythm and rituals of diplomatic exchange became another canvas for expressing disapproval. The annual exchange of New Year's gifts was a cornerstone of maintaining goodwill, a ceremonial affirmation of the relationship. For a Hittite king to forget this obligation was never an accident. It was a calculated and deeply insulting act. The absence of the expected convoy of treasures, the precious metals, fine textiles, and exotic animals sent a message as clear as any battle trumpet. You are no longer worthy of my generosity or my attention. The silence where there should have been celebration was deafening. Similarly, the timing of a response to a royal letter was a critical gauge of respect. A prompt reply signaled that the sender's concerns were a priority. Conversely, allowing a message to languish for months or even years was a powerful way to express contempt. It communicated that the sender's affairs were so insignificant that they did not warrant the time of a busy monarch. This temporal snubbing was a form of psychological warfare designed to frustrate and humiliate the waiting king, forcing him to dwell on his diminished status with each passing, silent day. The language within the body of a letter itself could be a minefield of backhanded compliments and veiled barbs. A Hittite king might write a letter that was, on the surface, perfectly polite, filled with the usual wishes for health and prosperity. But nestled within this civil prose would be a sentence that landed like a blow. A classic tactic was the seemingly benevolent reminder of past favors. A phrase like, "It brings me joy to recall how my armies marched to your aid when the enemy was at your gates," was a masterpiece of double-edged diplomacy. On one level, it was a statement of historical fact and a nod to past friendship. On a much sharper level, it was a stark reminder of dependency and debt. It highlighted a moment of weakness for the recipient, implicitly questioning his ability to defend his own kingdom without Hittite support. This was not just a walk down memory lane, it was a subtle threat, a warning that the protection which had been granted could also be withdrawn. It forced the recipient to remember his place in the imperial hierarchy, all under the gentle guise of nostalgic camaraderie. This entire system of coded disrespect served a crucial strategic purpose. It provided a controlled pressure valve for international tensions. In a world where outright war was costly, unpredictable, and devastating, these subtle insults allowed for a calibrated escalation of conflict. A king could signal his growing anger through a series of progressively sharper snubs, a delayed gift 1 year, a demoted title the next, giving the other party a clear opportunity to correct their behavior before the situation spiraled into open hostilities. It was a way of communicating, "You are on very thin ice," without having to break the ice entirely. This created a ladder of escalation, with insults on the lower rungs and war at the very top. A wise king, upon receiving a pointed diplomatic slight, would convene his advisors to decipher the message and consider a conciliatory response, perhaps sending an extra lavish gift or a particularly effusive letter to repair the relationship. In this way, the art of the insult was not just about expressing anger, it was a vital tool for conflict management, a language that allowed empires to argue, posture, and save face, all while keeping the peace balanced on a knife's edge. And so we come to the ultimate act of sealing an agreement, a moment where the dry text of a treaty was brought to life in a blaze of ritual and sacred theater. For the Hittites, a pact between kings was not truly binding until it was sanctified by the gods, and this transformation from political document to unbreakable covenant was achieved through a powerful 10th code, the language of ritual ratification. Imagine the scene not in a quiet palace chamber, but in an open-air sanctuary, under the watchful eyes of priests and towering statues of deities. The air would be thick with the smell of incense and the tension of the moment. The carefully negotiated clay tablet was now the script for a high-stakes performance, where every gesture, every spoken word, and every symbolic act was designed to burn the consequences of the agreement into the very souls of the participants. This was not a mere signing ceremony, it was a spiritual ordeal. The most common and potent ritual was the animal sacrifice. A sheep or a bull would be brought forward, and as the treaty's terms were recited aloud, the animal would be slain. This was not simply an offering to gain the gods' favor. The act was a gruesome, visceral metaphor. The fate of this creature was presented as the explicit fate of the oath breaker. As the life left the animal, the officiating priest would often declare that anyone who violated the terms of the treaty would be torn apart just like the sacrifice, their blood spilled and their lineage cut off. The language used was stark and terrifying, describing in graphic detail the destruction that would follow betrayal. This powerful imagery was meant to bypass the intellect and strike directly at the primal fear centers of the brain. A king might be able to rationalize breaking a political promise, but could he risk invoking a curse that promised his body would be destroyed and his name erased from the earth? The ritual made the abstract threat of divine punishment horrifyingly tangible. The participants themselves were often required to perform acts that deepened their personal connection to the oath. They might be made to touch sacred weapons, a spear, an axe, or a dagger while swearing the treaty. In doing so, they were not just swearing on the weapon, they were invoking the power of the war god it represented, inviting that deity to strike them down if they proved false. In other ceremonies, the kings and their delegates might drink a special ceremonial potion, a mixture of wine, water, and perhaps other ingredients while reciting the oath. This act of shared consumption was profoundly symbolic. Just as the liquid became one within their bodies, so too were their fates now intertwined by the agreement. The language spoken during this drinking ritual would emphasize unity and shared destiny, but also the poisonous consequences of betrayal, as if the potion itself would turn to venom in the veins of an oath breaker. The words chanted during these ceremonies were unlike the legalistic prose of the written treaty. They were highly formalized, rhythmic, and repetitive, almost like a magical incantation. This was a deliberate choice. The rhythmic, chant-like quality made the words easier to memorize, ensuring that the key clauses and curses would be remembered and retold even by those who could not read the cuneiform text. More importantly, this style of speech was believed to hold inherent power. In the Hittite worldview, spoken words were not just sounds, they were active forces that could shape reality, especially when uttered in a sacred context with the correct formula. By speaking the treaty aloud in this ritualized manner, the participants were not just describing an agreement, they were actively weaving its terms into the fabric of the cosmos, making it a fact as real and immutable as a mountain or a river. The gods were not just witnesses, they were now bound to enforce the pact as a part of the divine order. This entire ritual process served a crucial psychological and political function. It transformed a pragmatic, often self-interested political deal into a sacred covenant. A king who broke a treaty ratified in this manner was no longer just a tricky politician. He was a blasphemer, a sinner who had offended the entire pantheon. This raised the cost of betrayal exponentially. It was one thing to risk a war with the Hittite army. It was another to risk the eternal wrath of 1,000 gods, promising ruin in this life and damnation in the next. For the Hittite Empire, this ritual code was the final, most powerful layer of enforcement. After the careful persuasion of Brotherhood, the calculated threats in the treaty clauses, and the economic leverage of gift-giving, the ratification ceremony was the ultimate lock on the agreement. It appealed to the deepest fears and beliefs of the age, using the combined power of theater, faith, and visceral symbolism to make compliance feel less like a choice and more like a cosmic necessity. Yet for all the grand ceremonies and legalistic treaties, some of the most effective diplomatic work was accomplished through a much softer code, one written not with the stern voice of a king, but with the concerned tone of a friend. Alongside the formal state correspondence, the archives have preserved a different kind of letter altogether. These are the personal missives, where the great king of the Hittites might set aside his towering titles and write to his counterpart in Egypt about matters that had nothing to do with borders or tribute, and everything to do with the universal human experiences of family, health, and simple kindness. In one remarkable example, a Hittite monarch writes to the pharaoh Ramesses II, expressing profound gratitude for a shipment of a rare medicinal plant intended to aid the Hittite king's ailing eyesight. The language is deeply personal, filled with a sense of genuine relief and appreciation. He doesn't just thank Ramesses for the political gesture, he thanks him for the gift of health itself, describing how the remedy has brought him comfort. In that moment, the two most powerful men in the known world are connected not as rivals, but as two individuals facing the frailties of the human body, one offering help and the other receiving it with heartfelt thanks. This creation of a personal bond was a deliberate and sophisticated strategy. The exchange of such intimate details built up a vital reservoir of goodwill, a personal credit that could be drawn upon in times of political crisis. Imagine a subsequent letter arriving from Hattusa, this one addressing a tense border dispute. The pharaoh's scribes reading the formal complaint would now be filtering it through the memory of the recent, warm personal exchange. It becomes much harder to view the Hittite king as a purely abstract, hostile force when you have just been thanked for helping to heal his eyes. The personal connection creates a buffer, a space for de-escalation. A demand that might otherwise be seen as an ultimatum can now be interpreted as a problem to be solved between associates who have a history of mutual assistance. The king who confided a health scare is suddenly more human, his frustrations more understandable. This personal code did not replace the hard realities of power politics, but it oiled the gears, making the machinery of diplomacy run more smoothly when friction inevitably arose. The genius of this approach was its beautiful ambiguity. It was often impossible to disentangle sincere human emotion from cold political calculation, and that was precisely the point. When a Hittite king wrote to a fellow ruler expressing joy at the birth of a son or concern over a rumor of the recipient's illness, was it genuine? In many cases, yes. These men, separated by vast distances and the burdens of power, likely valued these rare channels of peer-to-peer communication. They were among the few people on earth who could truly understand the immense pressures the other faced. Yet, even the most heartfelt sentiment served a strategic purpose. By sharing a worry about a rebellious cousin or an ambitious subordinate, a king was not merely venting. He was subtly inviting his counterpart to offer reassurance, to perhaps even make a public statement of support that would strengthen the sender's hand in his own domestic struggles. The personal letter became a safe, deniable way to ask for help without issuing a formal and potentially embarrassing diplomatic request. It allowed a ruler to test the waters of an alliance with a personal confidence before committing to a state-level agreement. These letters reveal the profound humanity operating behind the imposing facade of empire. The clay tablets show us that these were not just titles on a page. They were fathers, sons, and husbands who experienced fear, gratitude, and the desire for connection. The Hittite king inquiring after the health of the Egyptian queen or sending a special gift for her children was engaging in a form of relationship building that feels instantly familiar to us today. He was nurturing a connection that transcended the transactional nature of their official interactions. This personal dimension of diplomacy reminds us that even at the highest levels of statecraft, decisions are ultimately made by people, and people are influenced by trust, empathy, and the memory of past kindnesses. The carefully cultivated friendship between two kings could become the most flexible and resilient tool in the diplomatic kit, a bond that could bend under the pressure of international disputes without breaking, ensuring that the lines of communication, both formal and personal, remained open even when the drums of war were beating in the distance. For the Hittite diplomat, history was never a dusty archive of forgotten events. It was a living, breathing weapon, a quarry from which they could mine the justification for their present-day demands. This 11th code, the Rhetoric of Historical Justification, reveals a profound understanding of a timeless political truth: whoever controls the past controls the present. When a Hittite scribe sat down to draft a treaty or a stern letter to a vassal king, he would often begin not with a list of demands but with a sweeping historical preamble. This was not the dry, objective history of a modern scholar. It was a carefully curated narrative, a story told with a very specific purpose in mind. The scribe would selectively recount the entire history of the relationship between the two states, emphasizing events that painted a picture favorable to Hittite interests. Every past interaction, every battle, every exchanged gift was woven into a tapestry that made the current Hittite position seem like the only logical, fair, and inevitable outcome. Consider the position of a local ruler in Syria who was hesitating to send his annual tribute. He might receive a letter from the great king that opened not with a threat, but with a seemingly gracious recollection. Thus says the great king, the letter might begin, "Have you forgotten the days when the enemy from the east marched upon your city, when your gates trembled and your people despaired?" It was I, the great king, who heard your cries. It was my army that marched for 30 days, my soldiers who shed their blood on your plains to drive the invader back into the desert. I saved your kingdom from annihilation. This recounting of a past rescue mission serves a powerful dual purpose. On one level, it reminds the vassal of a very real debt, a life-saving intervention that demands gratitude. But on a deeper, more manipulative level, it constructs a narrative of dependency. It frames the Hittite king not as a distant overlord, but as a perpetual protector, and the vassal not as an independent ruler, but as someone whose very survival is contingent on Hittite goodwill. Against the backdrop of this dramatic story, the subsequent demand for increased tribute no longer appears as an arbitrary act of greed, but as a reasonable, even modest, repayment for a debt that can never truly be settled. This rhetorical strategy was equally potent when dealing with past betrayals. If a vassal state had rebelled generations earlier, the Hittites would not let that memory fade. The story of that ancient rebellion would be kept alive in the archives and ritually invoked in new treaties with that state's descendants. The language would frame the rebellion as an act of shocking ingratitude, a black mark on the vassal's history that cast a long shadow over all future interactions. This created a permanent position of moral superiority for the Hittites. Any new request or demand could be prefaced with a reminder of this historical sin, implying that the vassal's ancestors had put the state in a perpetual position of having to prove its loyalty anew. The past transgression became a justification for present-day scrutiny and control, a way to keep a potentially powerful vassal in a permanently subordinate position by constantly reminding them of their family's shame. The brilliance of this code lay in its ability to make power dynamics feel like natural law. By constantly referencing a shared, if selectively remembered, history, the Hittites were able to frame their empire not as a recent conquest, but as the enduring and rightful order of things. A new vassal king ascending to the throne would find himself bound by treaties that recounted decades or even centuries of his predecessors' interactions with Hattusa. He was not entering a new relationship, he was stepping into a story that was already well underway, a story whose plot lines of loyalty, service, and dependency were already firmly established. This made resistance feel not just politically dangerous, but almost narratively incoherent. To rebel was to break from the very story of his own kingdom's identity, a story that the Hittites had taken great care to write themselves into as the indispensable heroes. This practice reveals a sophistication that goes far beyond military might. It shows an empire that understood the power of narrative to shape reality, using the past as a tool to legitimize its power in the present and to carefully script its desired future. For all its intricate design and psychological depth, the Hittite diplomatic code was not an invincible shield. It was a system built for a world of rational actors, rulers who could be influenced by calculated combinations of flattery, fear, and self-interest. But human ambition and desperation have a way of short-circuiting even the most elegant systems. There came moments when a vassal king, pushed to the brink by Hittite demands or tempted by the promise of a powerful new ally like Assyria, would make the conscious decision to burn the treaty tablet and raise the flag of rebellion. Similarly, the cherished fiction of brotherhood with Egypt could shatter in an instant when a new pharaoh ascended the throne, one who felt no personal connection to his Hittite counterpart and saw an opportunity for military glory. In these stark moments of breakdown, the entire sophisticated edifice of coded language was abandoned. The velvet glove came off, revealing the iron fist it was always designed to conceal. When diplomacy failed, the tone of Hittite correspondence underwent a dramatic and jarring shift. The carefully crafted salutations, the wishes for good health, the reminders of past friendship, all of it vanished. In their place came a new, brutally direct language of accusation and ultimatum. A letter to a rebellious vassal would no longer address him as a beloved servant. Instead, it would open with a cold, formal indictment, listing his transgressions in the starkest terms. The language of divine favor, once used to imply a celestial mandate, would transform into the language of divine wrath. The same gods who were invoked as guarantors of the treaty were now called upon as witnesses to the vassal's perfidy, with the Hittite king positioning himself as the avenging instrument of their justice. A typical declaration might read, "You have broken the oath sworn to the 1,000 gods of Hatti. You have chosen the path of evil. Therefore, the storm god has commanded me to march against you, to destroy your land, and to wipe your name from the earth." The subtlety was gone, replaced by the unambiguous rhetoric of righteous punishment. These failures exposed the code's ultimate limitation. It was a tool for managing power, not a substitute for it. The entire system rested on a fragile foundation of mutual self-interest and a credible threat of overwhelming force. A vassal remained loyal because the cost of rebellion, the almost certain destruction by the Hittite army, was greater than the burden of tribute and obligation. The Brotherhood with Egypt held because both empires recognized that a full-scale war would be mutually devastating. The diplomatic code was the lubricant that made this balance of power function smoothly, preventing minor slights from escalating into major conflicts. But when the underlying balance shifted, when a vassal believed he could win with outside help, or when a new pharaoh believed he could achieve a decisive victory, the code lost all its power. Words, no matter how clever, could not stop a charging chariot if the other side had calculated that the benefits of war now outweighed the risks. The most instructive examples come from the empire's later years, as internal instability and external pressures began to weaken the Hittite core. Vassal states on the periphery, sensing the central authority was faltering, would test their boundaries. A king might delay his tribute or fail to provide the full contingent of soldiers, actions that would have been unthinkable at the height of Hittite power. The initial Hittite response would still follow the old code, a sternly worded reminder of obligations, perhaps a veiled threat. But if the vassal detected hesitation, if the promised Hittite army was slow to materialize because it was dealing with a crisis elsewhere, the rebellion would solidify. At that point, the correspondence would cease altogether. There was no more need for letters, the time for talking was over, and the matter was handed over to the generals. The failure of the code in these instances was a symptom of a deeper sickness, the erosion of the power that gave the words their meaning in the first place. This is the most crucial lesson from the Hittite experience. Diplomatic language is ultimately a reflection of reality, not a creator of it. It can build trust, manage expectations, and prevent misunderstandings, but it cannot manufacture loyalty or goodwill from thin air. Its effectiveness is entirely dependent on a shared commitment to peace and a stable distribution of power. When those preconditions disappear, when ambition or fear overwhelms reason, the most beautifully crafted treaty becomes a meaningless piece of clay. The collapse of the Hittite diplomatic system in the face of the late Bronze Age collapse is the ultimate testament to this truth. When the entire international order disintegrated, when unknown invaders poured across borders and famine stalked the land, the codes of brotherhood and divine curses were silent. They were artifacts of a world that no longer existed, a poignant reminder that the art of diplomacy, for all its sophistication, is the highest expression of a civilized order and is often the first thing to be abandoned when that order begins to crumble. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the entire story, the monumental task facing the scholars who dedicate their lives to understanding this long, silent language. For us, reading a translated Hittite letter might seem straightforward, but for the experts, it is a constant battle against the erosion of time and context. The single greatest obstacle they face is the loss of the living, breathing culture that gave these words their true weight. Imagine trying to understand the subtle nuances of a modern political speech 1,000 years from now, with no knowledge of the inside jokes, the current events, or the unspoken rules of etiquette that shaped its delivery. This is the daily reality for historians of the Hittite world. A word that we confidently translate as friend from a Hittite king to a vassal might have carried a subtle connotation of patronage or condescension, a hint of superiority that is completely lost on us today. The tone of a letter, whether it was meant to be read as sincere, sarcastic, or threatening, was likely crystal clear to the scribe who penned it and the official who received it. But for us, that emotional subtext is often invisible, buried under millennia of silence. To overcome this, scholars have become detectives, employing a sophisticated toolkit of methods to reconstruct the lost nuances of Hittite speech. One of the most powerful techniques is comparative linguistics. By studying the evolution of related languages, like Luwian spoken within the empire itself or other early Indo-European tongues, linguists can trace the shifting meanings of words across time and cultures. They look for patterns, for roots that suggest a word might have once had a stronger or weaker meaning than its modern equivalent. Another crucial method involves immersing the text in its archaeological context. The physical location where a tablet was found speaks volumes. A treaty discovered in a royal archive in Hattusa carries a different official weight than a private letter found in the ruins of a provincial governor's house. The very type of tablet, its size, its shape, the quality of the script can indicate the importance of the message and the status of the recipient, providing vital clues about the tone the sender intended to convey. Perhaps the most revealing technique is what we might call big data archaeology. With a corpus of over 30,000 tablets, scholars can move beyond analyzing single documents and start looking for patterns across the entire collection. This is where the true code breaking happens. For instance, a historian might notice that a particular phrase, like "May the gods show you their true face," appears consistently in letters sent to vassal states that were on the brink of rebellion, but is almost entirely absent from correspondence with loyal allies. Through this pattern recognition, a phrase that sounds like a benign blessing to the untrained ear is revealed to be a severe and specific warning, a diplomatic shot across the bow. Similarly, a sudden increase in the frequency of messages to a particular region, coupled with a change in the formulaic greetings, can signal a period of rising tension that might not be explicitly mentioned in any single text. It is by connecting these thousands of dots that scholars can slowly map the invisible emotional and political landscape of the empire. This detective work is never truly finished. It is an ongoing conversation with the past. Every new tablet discovery, every fresh archaeological excavation, has the potential to overturn decades of understanding. A single letter found in a forgotten storeroom might provide the missing context that finally explains why a certain king was addressed with such unusual coldness in his final years. The process of decipherment is itself a form of modern-day cryptography, a relentless pursuit of meaning that requires not just knowledge of grammar and vocabulary, but also a deep intuition for human psychology and the intricate dance of power. It is a powerful reminder that the secret language of the Hittites has not given up all its secrets. The clay tablets may be silent, but in the hands of skilled interpreters, they continue to whisper, revealing new layers of complexity and cunning in the diplomatic strategies of an empire that understood, better than most, that the most lasting victories are won not with the sword, but with the carefully chosen word. The secret language of Hittite diplomacy stands as a towering masterpiece of political innovation, a complex system of verbal codes that managed to hold a vast and diverse empire together for nearly 5 centuries. Their genius lay in a profound understanding that words are not merely tools for communication, but are in fact the ultimate instruments of power. They crafted a reality where the comforting fiction of brotherhood could mask deep-seated rivalries, where a meticulously placed curse could deter rebellion more effectively than 1,000 soldiers, and where a strategically ambiguous clause in a treaty could maintain control with a flexibility that brute force could never achieve. These were not simple deceptions. They were the sophisticated mechanisms of a state that had mastered the psychological dimensions of rule, recognizing that controlling how people think and feel is the most durable form of authority. Their legacy, however, is not confined to the silent clay tablets unearthed by archaeologists. It lives on, echoing through the corridors of power in every modern capital around the world. The next time you hear a world leader speak of an ironclad alliance or a strategic partnership, listen closely. Beneath the contemporary jargon, you can hear the faint but unmistakable whisper of a Hittite scribe, who understood that such terms create a public framework of solidarity while carefully avoiding the concrete commitments that could prove inconvenient later. The concept of diplomatic immunity that protects ambassadors today is a direct descendant of the sacred protocols that guaranteed the safety of Hittite messengers, ensuring that even in times of tension, a channel for dialogue remained open. The careful, non-committal language used in United Nations resolutions, filled with phrases like, "the parties should endeavor to," rather than "the parties shall," is a modern application of the Hittite code of strategic ambiguity, allowing for consensus without forcing any nation into a corner it is not ready to occupy. Their story teaches us a timeless lesson about the nature of international relations, revealing that diplomacy has always been a grand theater where language serves as both the script and the weapon. In this theater, every word is chosen for its effect, every phrase is calibrated for its impact, and the true meaning often lies hidden beneath a polished surface of politeness and protocol. The Hittites were the original masters of this craft, and their techniques have been refined and passed down through the ages, from the courts of medieval Europe to the summit meetings of the 21st century. We have journeyed together inside their world of empire and betrayal, deciphering the codes they used to build and maintain their power, but this journey does not have to end here. Now that you know what to listen for, what hidden codes will you begin to notice in the world around you? In the carefully worded press releases from government officials, in the subtle shifts in tone between nations, and in the diplomatic dances reported on the nightly news, the legacy of the Hittites is playing out in real time. If this exploration into the secrets of ancient statecraft has captivated you, consider subscribing for more journeys into the mysteries of history. We have only scratched the surface of the past's enduring influence on our present. And we would love to hear your thoughts. What modern diplomatic phrases do you think carry the most hidden weight? Share your own decodings in the comments below, and let's continue